The psychology of people who stop explaining themselves. At some point in life, something strange happens. You stop explaining yourself. Not because you don't care. Not because you're angry. But because something inside you quietly decides, enough. And here's the scary part. When someone stops explaining themselves, people don't notice it immediately. There's no announcement. No dramatic goodbye. No final argument. They just go quiet. They answer less. They argue less. They defend themselves less. And if you're paying attention, that silence is louder than any explanation they ever gave. Because psychology tells us something powerful here. People don't stop explaining when they lose. They stop explaining when they finally understand. Think about it. When was the last time you explained yourself for a long time? You probably cared deeply. You wanted to be understood. You wanted fairness. You wanted the other person to see you. Now flip it. Think about someone who barely explains anything anymore. Short answers. No emotional justifications. No long messages. No need to prove their point. That's not weakness. That's a psychological shift. And once it happens, there's no going back. Today, let's talk about the psychology of people who stop explaining themselves. Because once you understand what's happening inside their mind, you'll never read silence the same way again. Here's the first truth most people miss. People who stop explaining themselves were once the ones who explained the most. They over-explained. They clarified. They defended. They gave context. They tried to fix misunderstandings before they even became problems. Not because they were insecure, but because they believed understanding could save relationships. Psychologically, these people have high empathy. They naturally put themselves in other people's minds. They assume, if I explain it better, they'll get it. So they talk. They reason. They justify. Again and again. Until one day, they realize something uncomfortable. Explaining doesn't create understanding. When the other person has already decided who you are, that's the breaking point. Because the human brain hates wasting energy. When effort produces no result, the brain slowly shuts that behavior down. So instead of asking, how can I explain this better? Their mind starts asking, why am I explaining this at all? That's when silence begins. Not the cold kind. Not the angry kind. The tired kind. The kind that comes from explaining your heart to someone who only listens to reply. Psychology calls this cognitive disengagement. It's the moment your mind emotionally steps back to protect itself. You see, explaining yourself is vulnerable. It requires emotional exposure. You're saying, here's how I think. Here's how I feel. Please understand. When that vulnerability is repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or used against you, the brain adapts. It doesn't scream. It doesn't fight. It doesn't beg. It withdraws. People who stop explaining themselves aren't shutting others out. They're shutting off a behavior that caused them pain. And here's something subtle. They still understand others. They still listen. They still observe. They just no longer feel the need to be understood by everyone. That's a massive psychological upgrade. Because the moment you stop needing validation through explanation, you regain control of your emotional energy. You're no longer negotiating your worth. You're no longer convincing people to respect you. You're no longer asking for permission to be who you are. Silence becomes a boundary, and boundaries are incredibly powerful. Another key trait of people who stop explaining themselves, they've accepted a hard truth. Not everyone deserves access to their inner world. Early in life, many of us believe honesty should be rewarded. That openness leads to closeness. That clarity solves conflict. But psychology teaches us otherwise. Some people don't seek understanding. They seek control. And explanations give them material. When someone explains themselves repeatedly, manipulators listen carefully. Not to understand, but to find leverage. So when a person stops explaining, it's often because they've learned discernment. They've learned that silence protects clarity. That fewer words mean fewer misunderstandings. That not every thought needs a witness. This doesn't make them arrogant. It makes them selective. And selection is a sign of self-respect. Because confidence isn't loud. It doesn't over-justify. It doesn't over-defend. Confident people let their actions speak. And if someone misunderstands, they let them. That's not indifference. That's emotional maturity. Here's where it gets interesting. People who stop explaining themselves often become intimidating, without trying. Why? Because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. When you don't explain, others are forced to interpret. And the human mind hates gaps in information. So people project. They assume. They guess. And suddenly, the quiet person seems powerful. Not because they're dominant, but because they're no longer predictable. Psychologically, predictability equals control. The less someone knows about your inner reactions, the less they can manipulate you. That's why calm silence unsettles insecure people. They want a reaction. They want clarification. They want reassurance. And when they don't get it, they feel exposed. That's why some people get angry when you stop explaining. They'll say, "You've changed. You're cold. You don't care anymore." What they really mean is, "I can't read you like I used to." And that loss of access feels threatening. But let's be clear. Stopping explanations doesn't mean becoming emotionally unavailable. It means choosing where your emotional energy goes. These people still explain themselves, just not to everyone. They explain to those who listen, to those who ask with curiosity, not accusation, to those who don't weaponize vulnerability. That's emotional intelligence. They've learned that being understood by everyone is impossible, and trying will drain you. So instead, they focus on alignment. If someone misunderstands them, they don't panic. They don't chase. They don't correct every narrative. They let life reveal truth over time. Because consistency beats explanation. Always. And this mindset creates a strange side effect. Peace. Less talking. Less defending. Less proving. More observing. More choosing. More inner stability. There's also a deep self-trust component here. People who constantly explain themselves often doubt whether their feelings are valid. So they outsource validation. But when someone stops explaining, it usually means they trust their internal compass. They no longer need others to agree. In order to feel secure, they don't argue about how they feel. They don't debate their boundaries. They don't justify their decisions. They simply act. And that level of self-trust changes everything. Conversations become shorter. Responses become clearer. Life becomes quieter. Not empty. Focused. This is why these people often outgrow environments. Friend groups. Workplaces. Even relationships. Not because they think they're better, but because they refuse to stay where they must constantly explain their existence. Silence, in this case, is self-respect made visible. Another psychological layer most people ignore: grief. People stop explaining themselves. After grieving the fantasy of being understood, they let go of the hope that, if I say it differently, they'll finally get me. That hope is painful to release, because it means accepting reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Once that grief passes, freedom appears. No more rehearsing conversations in your head. No more overthinking messages. No more emotional exhaustion from being misread. You start living instead of translating yourself. And ironically, this is when people begin respecting you more. Because humans respect certainty. They respect calm. They respect those who don't beg to be heard. Silence becomes authority. Now here's the part few talk about. When you stop explaining yourself, you also stop attracting certain people. The drama seekers leave. The emotional parasites get bored. The ones who fed on your reactions move on. And that's not a loss. That's filtration. What remains are people who value clarity, not control. Connection, not confusion. These relationships feel lighter, cleaner, more real, because there's no performance, no constant defense, no emotional negotiations, just presence. This is why people who stop explaining themselves often seem grounded. They've simplified their inner world. And simplicity is powerful. Complex minds seek quiet lives. So if you've noticed yourself explaining less lately, pause before judging it. You might not be becoming distant. You might be becoming aligned. You might not be shutting down. You might be leveling up. Psychology doesn't see silence as absence. It sees it as choice. A choice to protect your energy. A choice to trust yourself. A choice to stop pouring clarity into closed minds. And the most important thing to remember, people who truly care will ask. They will listen. They will try. Everyone else doesn't need an explanation. Silence will do the talking for you. And once you learn this, you'll never feel the urge to explain yourself the same way again.